Good morning, and welcome to another edition of San Francisco Live's Live Talks from Bird and Beckett. My name is Denise Sullivan. I write a column for The Examiner, and today's guest is Jennifer Beach, an activist and co-founder of Prison Radio. We talked, I guess it was just about a little more than 2 years ago.
Right.
And haven't seen you since the pandemic. So, how are you, Jennifer Beach?
Well, it's a beautiful day today, so I'm doing fine. The pandemic raised like enormous possibilities and challenges for Prison Radio, and I was really glad that we had a robust line of communication inside prisons as the pandemic emerged and kind of invaded those communities so aggressively.
Wow, let's dive right in. I want to go back and learn a bit about your personal history and how you got started with prison abolition advocacy and the broadcasting. But since communication really is on our minds and the modes of communication throughout the pandemic, I mean, here we are now without masks. This is very new for us, to be indoors without and whatnot. The complications faced by incarcerated people, I spoke to a couple of people who had loved ones inside.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's unimaginable for us who are out here and don't have familiarity with a lot of the issues about communication under quote-unquote normal circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
So how was it exacerbated during the pandemic?
Well, it's always hard to communicate through the prison wall, right? There's a lot of obstacles. People, when they call, they have to call collect. That means you have to have an account set up in advance. Often your number has to be approved in advance. So if you move or get a new cell phone number, then you have to go through a whole other process. And then and then your phone conversations are recorded, and they're constantly interrupted by a reminder that you're being recorded. And then there's an abrupt end to the call where you're told there's 60 seconds left, and then it's over. And there's often phone lines are very poor quality, or there's other people who are, even though it's your allotted time to call out, you might have other people who are kind of eager to get the phone line. So there's, and in some places like San Quentin, they move a phone station from cell to cell, and so you touch and use the phone that somebody else just touched and used. And so there's myriad obstacles to getting information, prison is a fortress, right? So the mechanisms of communication are tightly controlled and antiquated, and everything that comes out from the prison's perspective is curated and often incorrect and often limited. And so really, even if you have a program, like some people might be familiar with Ear Hustle, which is a beautiful program that comes out of San Quentin. It's a radio program, it's high quality, and they have dynamic and talented participants. But that's a state-sponsored narrative. And so everything that comes out of Ear Hustle, which is a program that was probably shut down for the early parts of the pandemic anyway, but it's all kind of has to be approved in explicit and implicit ways. Whereas one of the things that I think has always been powerful about prison radio and became like really emphasized the importance of it is that we have nothing to do with the prison itself. You call us from inside and we record what you have to say. And so we were able to get kind of raw accounts of what was happening in Georgia, in Indiana, in Michigan, in California, inside of these prisons when nobody else was getting that information. We even had we had the New York Times calling us. Because there just wasn't a robust system of getting stories out. And as it is, people face consequences for calling us. But they know that, and they choose to do that. This is important enough to them to take those risks. So sometimes people get put in the hole if they call us, or if their messaging is very irritating to the prison, or there's myriad small and large ways that you can be punished for doing it. But at least there's an option for people to make decisions about whether they're by calling us and saying their story or their experience, there's the possibility, it's a glimmer of communication that otherwise in most places there's nothing. And even things like ear hustle, it's beautiful that it exists, but you only get that at a place like San Quentin, right? In the vast majority of prisons, you have nothing like that at all.
Right. Yeah. You bring up a couple really great points, and I'm also reminded that a lot of folks may not be super familiar with prison radio. So, well, yeah. I mean,
so right. No, that's helpful.
My fault. But prison radio does run on a number of independent public radio stations across the country, right? In short segments, and another note. Bear with me while I unpack this. Like you said, at San Quentin, there are all kinds of programs available. It's an exemplary prison program for various programs in the arts and other work and type of activities. However, when you started prison radio for the purpose of Mumia Abu Jamal doing his reports from inside in state prison in Pennsylvania, quite a different situation.
Right, for sure, yes.
So just briefly, so we can make that distinction like you were saying about ear hustle versus the briefs from prison radio.
I mean, in the beginning, so prison radio is committed to airing voices of people living inside prisons. And for the most part, we've done U.S. prisons, but not exclusively. And not our very first programming, but early programming, and a dominant element of our programming for many years was really to give Mumia Abu Jamal, who was a trained journalist before he was in prison, an opportunity to share his work. And we see him as one of the leading intellectual figures alive in the United States today. And so, but we had I just saw this talk by Angela Davis at she just got this award. She and Ruthie Gilmore and Mike Davis got this Lannan Prize. And so I just saw a panel with them, and they asked Angela how she began doing prison work, and she is actually one of the people who organized me into doing prison work, but she said exactly the same thing I would say, that she initially began politically organizing around prisons in support of political prisoners. And that was true for Noelle and I when we launched Prison Radio. But you only have to do that for a very brief period of time before you start asking larger questions about prisons, who they're serving, what purposes, why, how much they cost, who's paying the consequence, are they there to keep us safe, or are they there as an apparatus of control, right? All of those things become very quickly evident. So initially we did a 13-part series at the Dublin Federal Correctional Institute, with political prisoners and prisoners of war women who were there. And they said, you have to find a way to record Mumia, who was at the time on death row in Pennsylvania. And they said it very aggressively. And so we said, okay, we have to figure out, even though we're this scrappy, newly launching project in San Francisco with zero funding and no personal wealth, we have to find a way to get to do that. And so, we maxed out credit cards and we made connections, and we went to, and this was in the early 90s, we went into to Huntington State Prison, which is in the middle of Pennsylvania, and into this fortress institution, which I think has subsequently been closed. It was a large brick institution. It was very formidable. It was 105 degrees out. And we didn't have a car with, we had borrowed someone's car. It didn't have air conditioning. We didn't have, we had borrowed equipment. We had, and Noelle Hanrahan, who I think, really, I want to give her a lot of credit for being so intrepid. She insisted on getting permission. She made the prison let us in. She made the prison, I said, there's no way, because even though we had permission in advance, I said, there's no way they're going to let us into this prison with this equipment. But she has never been intimidated by those kinds of obstacles. And we got in, and it was very challenging recording conditions because Mumia was behind glass. And He couldn't bring any paper into the visit. He strip searched before each visit and after each visit. And so he was going to read commentaries. So we had to bring the commentaries and we had to tape them to the glass. And we had to get the guard to bring a mic around onto the other side so he could be mic'd, which was, every step of the way was a challenge. And this is our very first visit. And we had a little DAT recording device. This is before any of this, streaming. And then he started to speak. And then we realized in a way that because his voice was not commonly available before, and we hadn't heard very much of his work before because it just wasn't possible to hear it. But as soon as he started to speak, we realized we had a grade A radio talent that we just hadn't 100% understood before. And Noelle turned to me. This is my favorite opening story about prison radio. Noelle turned to me and said, "You have to get them to turn the air conditioning off because it's creating a hum and it's interfering with our sound quality." And I said, "This is a giant prison and it's 105 degrees out and they hate us. There is just no way that they're going to turn off the air conditioning for the institution in order for us to do this interview." And she said, "Make them do it." And so I left the room and I went to the woman sitting at the desk and I said, "I need you to turn off the air conditioning because it's creating an unworkable hum." And she looked at me and she said, "What?" And I thought to myself, this woman is never going to turn off the air conditioning. And I said, "You have to turn off the air conditioning." And then she got up and she turned off the air conditioning, which it just proves you never get anything unless you demand it, right? And so, it's really, there's this phrase, there's a book that we like, "When we fight, we win." And it's really true even at every stage, right? At every stage. Mm-hmm. And that was our first, and we recorded probably 15 commentaries that session. And then we came back several years. And in those days you had a little DAT tape and you had to go to, have a little editing station at your house and you're at KPFA, and then you'd have to physically get the tape to all of the radio stations. We did that for a long time. But then as technology changed, we were able to really expand our program. And now we have over 100 correspondents who call in from all over the country. And you'll find, if you go to our website, prisonradio.org, which I super think you should do, we have a newly designed website that's searchable and has people by correspondent, and there are tag searches. We have people calling in from prisons in forgotten places, right? Onion State Prison in Georgia, right? You hear from women in Michigan. You hear, and I really think, we were very lucky because our sound engineer has a home studio because he's a musician and sound engineer, that were his day job. And so when San Francisco shut down, he moved his operation into his sound studio. And that really enabled us to go uninterrupted right into the pandemic when the need to hear from people was greater than ever before. And so, I'm very grateful to him and his flexibility and to the whole staff. Everybody pitched in and said, "We're going to make this work." And everybody took their work home. And we were able to do it at one of the most important times to hear from people inside prisons. Mm. Because you just weren't hearing anything, and a whole, we'd hear from Georgia, we hear a man down every hour. They call out man down, and we don't know what that means. And the lack of information that we all struggled with through the early aspects of the early moments in the pandemic, and that we still struggle with, is only amplified enormously for the people inside, right? So man down, man down, man down. We don't know. Does that mean they're sick? Does that mean they're dead? Does that mean it's COVID? Does that mean, and so to be able to hear those experiences, I think just was really critical, mm-hmm. because otherwise people would be dying in a box, right, all by themselves. And so I never felt like our work was more important than during the pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things I personally love and appreciate about your work is the documentation of our times, when we are the largest incarcerator of people in the entire
Mm-hmm.
world, over 2 million people in prison at this time. But at the same time, I also appreciate that you, like Angela Davis, like Mumia, offer us hope, mm-hmm. Against incredible odds, and you're part of this larger legacy of letters from prison, right? And this brings us really straight
Right.
to the book,
Right.
right? Mumia has written how many books?
Like, I think like 15 books.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like 15 books. But this is a special project, A, because it's the newest, B, because it's a long-held kind of idea to make a version inspired by one of the great inspirers, Howard Zinn, to have this alternative history, right? Co-written with Stephen Vittoria, and all done from no longer on death row, but the sentence has been turned to
like without the possibility of parole, right?
Right.
LWOP, yeah.
But that's a win,
Right? No, that was a win. Yeah, that was a 2011 win, and we're working on another one. Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
So why don't we work on getting the message from Mumia to explain a little bit about the book project?
Okay. Should I do? We have. I just want to explain briefly that this is a Murder Incorporated is a 3-part trilogy, and it is it's an expansive work that treats all of American history. So it sees itself as a companion piece to Zinn, who tells a story of the United States from the perspective of workers, or of Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, who has an indigenous people's history of the United States, who tells the story of the United States from the perspective of the people who lived here, who live here first, and who continue to live here, and but from this takes the story of America from the lens of its international imperial project, and so it's extremely long. It's three parts. It's very detailed. It's vivid. I think that they really looked to Eduardo Galeano in terms of its structural choices of having kind of different voices and tones within the book. And I think it's really a must read for anyone who wants to understand kind of a broader perspective of American history. Or the history of the U.S. empire, which is really what it sees itself as.
Right. I'll let you.
And then this is. Hold on, I have to wake it back up.
Yeah, I'll let you work on that. I as I remember, it's 4,000 pages in total, and who could digest that all in one sitting? So you opted to publish it in 3 separate volumes, and I think that actually is a really nice idea because it gives people an opportunity to digest what they've read. Also, a 4,000 page book is really unpractical to lug around.
Okay, I finally got it on there.
But
wait, it was impossible to.
Impossible.
Yeah.
So the 3 volume set. And I think we can try it.
So this is just a short clip of Mumia talking about the launching of the first volume.
Murder, Inc., the latest work. When does a book come to life? When a writer writes it, or when a reader reads it? Thoughts such as these emerge as my latest work is released into a waiting world. Murder, Inc., Dreams of Empire, Part 1. By yours truly and Stephen Vittoria, published by Prison Radio. I said my. I should have said our. For this work is truly the work of 2 minds, 2 pair of eyes, 2 psyches with one central thesis: anti-imperialism against the empire. Vittoria is a filmmaker and a documentarian who worked for years to produce a film capturing the voices of some of America's finest thinkers, like the late, brilliant Gore Vidal and the equally compelling Dick Gregory. But the film project never gelled, and Stephen, never one to waste gems, reasoned that the words of such gifted thinkers might have a second life in print. When he suggested we join forces and write a book, I was initially hesitant, but this was something I'd never done before. My earlier book, A Classroom and a Cell, co-authored with scholar activist Dr. Mark Lamont Hill, was really a conversation made by months of recordings between us, of literally thinking out loud. This would be work, hard work, of research, reading, thinking, interpreting, and then writing our findings into the world as history. Such a project is hard enough doing alone, but 2 guys separated by brick, steel, coast experiences? As risky as it was a delicious challenge. Why not? why not cast caution to the winds and, as a sneakers company put it in their ads, just do it. We split the work 50-50 and went to work. We read many of the same texts and either called or wrote one another. We resolved not to cut corners, but also not to cut harsh, unyielding truths. In the center of our work stood the presence of Zen, whose The People's History of the United States informed and influenced our work. We envisioned not the U.S., but the world itself. More, the empire. Why not? Murder, Inc., the definitive history of the U.S. empire, was born. We have just begun, but there is more to come, hot on the trail of this one. We think Howard Zen would be proud. From Imprisoned Nation, this is Mumia Abu Jamal.
Great.
Yep.
Murder, Inc., the late...
The first thing that came to mind is, how is Mumia's health and at this time?
So Mumia's health, he'll tell you he's great. And he's not exactly great. He's so he had emergency bypass surgery maybe a year ago now. And so he's living with heart disease and with the remnants of the hepatitis that we were able to get treated. So this was a beautiful story. It was terrible, but beautiful. He had hepatitis, and the policy of the prison was only to treat hepatitis at its very latest stages. And so because treating it is very expensive. And so Prison Radio worked with progressive lawyers in Pennsylvania and sued the Department of Corrections of Pennsylvania and got Mumia treatment, but that resulted in everyone in the prisons getting treatment. So, and this is one of the things about Mumia's case, is that every time he's had a victory, it's had a kind of cascading impact on other people. But now he's living with heart disease in prison, and it's, anybody who knows anything about heart disease, the key elements to heart recovery is eating well and getting exercise, and those are impossible in prisons. And as our correspondents age, right, as the boomers get older, the boomers in prison get older, we see the consequences of people living for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years in an institution where they have, high sodium diets with no fruits and vegetables, very limited opportunities for exercise, and no kind of food options, right? So that, there's this, movement coming out of the Bay Area, right? Decolonize your diet, right? So these are people living with a colonized diet for sure. And those are habits, I talked to someone who had gotten out after 35 years, and he said, I don't know that I can ever, and he had diabetes and heart disease, and he said, it's really hard to change the way that I've eaten, that I've been forced to eat for my whole adult life. And so for him, even living outside, it was hard to manage his diabetes and heart disease. And I think, and for Mumia, it's an endless struggle. And so that's one of our calls right now, is we have a postcard campaign to the Department of Corrections to improve the eating and exercise options, because we have an aging prison population, and so we're looking at, so again, in so many ways, Mumia's case is both ordinary and extraordinary, and this is, our tagline is liberating voices, and it's not that we're it's in part that we see ourselves as liberating the voices of people in prison, but it's also that we see their voices as liberating us, because we understand the conditions that we actually all live in, if we understand the conditions in prisons, and because the hope and resilience that people living inside prison have to offer is something that is a precious commodity that we should all be I say everybody should visit a prison. Everybody should try to find a way to visit a prison, because you can't understand the world you live in if you can't see its largest apparatus, and every time you think, oh, why does my kid have a classroom of 35 students? Or there was just a story about Buena Vista Horace Mann where there's gas leaks and vermin and it's too hot and too cold, and people bring blankets. And my kids went to Buena Vista Horace Mann. My kids went to Horace Mann. So, these are the conditions our children are being educated in. And the reason is because as a community, we have decided instead to invest in these extremely expensive apparatuses that hold people in prison for decades and decades and decades. And we can see this through, Mumia's story only illustrates these common threads and phenomenons.
Mm-hmm. And this is a message that Mumia has been bringing in books and then later in the broadcasts for decades now, right? It's incredible that we can look back at the early writings and see that all of the issues that were front burner at that time are still front burner at this time.
Right.
But we have this extra layer of more incarceration. Just everything's amped up. And Mumia speaks so eloquently about that over and over again. This hyper, mega, the supermax,
Right,
it's just,
right,
it's out of control.
right.
So, though we are, very aware of a lot of this stuff here in the Bay Area because we live in this special place, where a lot of the activists that work nationally got their start. We know this, right? But a lot of the information, again, is new to people across the country. Like you said, until they've been inside or a member of the family has been and it touches their lives, there's no way to
Right.
really access any of this real information. So this is one of the services that you continue to provide. I'd like to hear a little bit about some of the younger and other reporters that have gotten on board and been willing to take the kinds of risks that Mumia and some of the elder prisoners have been doing, who will take their place and be that voice.
Well, we always say, we look to Nelson Mandela and Robben Island, right? That when you incarcerate an activist, you're giving them a breeding ground, right? An opportunity. You're offering a university, right? And I do think, we have Jamil Perrant, we have a host of women calling in from Michigan right now. We have, there's just, it's every day. There's not every day, but every week we feel like we have a new person calling in and talking about sometimes people talk about their own story as examples of a distorted sense of justice, but sometimes they just talk about the conditions in their prisons or the conditions of their prosecution. There's one person is doing a conversation with their daughter about parenting from prison. Many people are doing programs among their colleagues in prison, and they talk about what the leadership that they're offering. I mean, there's really a wide range of voices coming out of prison radio right now, and I think it's great. I think people who teach should consider, playing a clip. It's all right there. You can just stream it just like I did. Any piece that you like, whether it's searchable, so you can look up George Floyd. You can look up, and what's really interesting sometimes is. To me, what's always fascinating is that it's so hard to get information into the prison, right? It's hard to get information out, but it's also hard to get information in. But Mumia, for instance, always knows about everything before anybody does. And I always want to know how. I found out that Maya Angelou had died because he called in a commentary that day. And I said, but how do you know that? I have a phone that gives me alerts, right? So, but people have, you realize, it's post-structuralism or something, right? You realize as much as there are these large institutions of control, there's always been ways that people work around that and get information around that. And you can see that if you start to look at prisoners' work. And we want to be part of that. We see ourselves as part of that. Yeah.
Well, and I will just add that Mumia, as an exceptional person, a prophet, a poet, a visionary, that's how he accesses the information.
Right.
Just, that's, that's the inside track on that. But why don't you tell us, this is a nice way to get into how did you get into the work? You mentioned Angela Davis kind of brought you along,
Right,
but
right.
let's go way back and
Okay,
maybe.
so I was really lucky to go to San Francisco State University in the mid '80s, and I studied with Angela Davis and another academic, Chino Sole, and they taught a course called Incarcerated Women. And through that, and I took that course, and I was a TA of that course, and they invited community scholars in to present about their work, and really it was I would say the 1980s lesbian feminist community in San Francisco that people like Bo Brown, formerly incarcerated people, like I said, I've been listening to Angela's a lot of her work lately, so she's kind of high in my brain. But she says I was organized by formerly incarcerated people, and I can say the same. I was organized by formerly incarcerated people, and that is in the it's George Jackson, really the Panther, who was at San Quentin in the late '60s, who insisted so that there has to be leadership from people inside prisons. For any progressive movement requires that, and certainly a movement around prisons. Right? There's a phrase they like to use: nothing for us without us, right? So, and I was organized. I was lucky enough to be organized by formerly incarcerated people, first around political prisoners, and I did work in support of the women at Dublin and against the Lexington Control Unit. I worked with a group called Out of Control, which was a lesbian committee to support women political prisoners, and I worked with a group called Women Against Imperialism, and we had so you learn certain principles of organizing if you do prison work, right? That you have to have communication, that you have to have open communication, that you have to be accountable to people, and that you have to be you have to respond to their needs, and you have to take their demands and kind of navigate them, because sometimes they're not possible, right? So when we went to visit Mumia the first time, which was a big stretch of our credit card and our capacity. We all had to take time off our day jobs. And he said he was in the middle of Pennsylvania, and we had gotten the ticket to Pittsburgh was cheaper than the ticket to Philadelphia. So Pennsylvania's a long state. So we flew into Pittsburgh, the West End, because it was cheaper. But right before we left, he said, okay, I've changed my mind. I'm not going to see you until you interview Ramona Africa, who had just gotten out of prison and was in Philadelphia. So we did. It was in those days you couldn't just change your flight, and so we had to we came into Pennsylvania. We came into Pittsburgh, and we had to take an all-night Greyhound to Philadelphia and interview Ramona, and which was a fantastic experience. And I'm very glad that we did that. And we had the Puerto Rican independence movement was very supportive of us, who we had relationships with, and they let us stay. This is the beautiful thing about a movement for social change. Strangers will open up their home to you. They'll feed you rice and beans and get you from a bus station to a train station. And that happened to us along the way. And it was really important for us to meet Ramona Africa, who had just gotten out of prison. She had been in prison for 8 years after the bombing of the MOVE compound in 1985. And then we had to rent a car and drive again halfway across the state to Huntington. So, you're not doing him some favor that you're going to show up, right? If he's going to talk to you, you're going to do what he wants you to do. He thought that was important, and I agreed that was important. But you have to have that flexibility and agility. And now, if you talk to kind of whites, anti-racist organizers, they talk about accountability a lot. Well, you really learn that if you work with people in prison, right? And it's a great kind of training ground for any kind of political organizing, I think. So I was really lucky. I met really fantastic people who organized me and gave me both a conceptual and operational grounding for doing this work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when we talked the last time, you explained a little bit about how the Bay Area became a kind of epicenter for this kind of work. And sure, it dates back to the Black Panthers founding and the movements to free those folks who were often imprisoned just for being, right? There were
right.
And we see this now in the movement against police violence, where a lot of the the incarcerations have nothing to do with any real crimes that were committed, right? So, I mean, I'm explaining this because part of our listenership today and viewership may not be familiar with all the jargon that you use every day, right? The ideas like defunding the police and abolishing prisons. This is still kind of foreign to a segment of the audience. So I just wanted to get a little bit of clarification on some of that stuff. But let's go back to the 60s. And that time where I think everyone's familiar because now it's part of history. And now we know that wrongs were done. And if you haven't noticed for 50, 60 years, the wrongs are still being done. And we still have a problem with police violence, which is the reason why Mumia is...
That's correct. From his earliest career,
yeah,
right? That's why he's in prison was because of he covered police corruption, right?
Right. And if we go before the 60s, we can... This is what this book is largely about.
Right.
The way that the country was founded and the way that white supremacy and its ties to policing, it's all laid out and explained in case you need that explained, right? So going back to my question, which was, yes, how the Bay Area became a place where people could become educated and trained and organized to do this work and actually have an impact like we've seen in recent years.
Well, I'm really glad that you asked that question because at this panel that I just watched of Angela Davis and Ruthie Wilson Gilmore, who I really has... So if you're interested in learning more about abolition, prison abolition as a concept, which is a term that I use in an easy way, but does require a little bit of kind of thinking and reading and exploration in order to kind of become comfortable with. I really recommend that people just do a YouTube search for Ruthie Wilson Gilmore. She did an incredible interview in the last year with The Intercept, where she really lays out the fundamental principles of abolitionist thinking, which are about building communities. So that's one thing about that term abolition. I consider myself a prison abolitionist. I believe that prisons are an insult to our community, and so that's just to unpack that term, just to recognize that that's a large concept that maybe I use that term kind of flippantly. But I think, but they also, in this same panel that I just listened to the other day, they talked about this question, why California, right? Because Mike Davis is from Los Angeles, so it was California, not the Bay Area. But so I just heard Angela Davis and Mike Davis and Ruthie Wilson Gilmore, who are leaders in the abolitionist movement, talk to this very question. And so one of the things that they said was that California is kind of embodies in a kind of an extreme way many of the contradictions of the project of the United States. So you have this possibility of you have this vision of a kind of a better society, and you have all of the class and racial constraints that have made that impossible. And it's all kind of extreme. And that's why you had the Black Panthers starting in Oakland. And, it was a location of the Great Migration. So even though the Bay Area has had a big diminishment of a Black community in the last 15, 20 years, it did have a very strong presence of people who had come here to build a life. And that is actually a big part of why it is, such a center of progressive thought. It's not the only reason, but it's one kind of solid pillar, I think, of it. So the Black Panthers came out of Oakland because the police misconduct, the police violence was so profound in Oakland. That's really, police violence is why there is a Black Panthers, and it's police violence in Oakland specifically is why there was ever a Black Panthers. Now, I just want to say one thing about this idea that people being in prison for kind of trumped up charges, which is not, that's not a small matter. That really, there was a very large program from the federal government to identify powerful leaders and to find any mechanism possible to take them down. And it was called Cointelpro, and it's extensively documented. And that is what took down all of many of the leaders in the Black Panther, and trumped up charges or opportunistic charges were part of it, but were long protracted legal battles. So were kind of vindictive arrests, and so were a myriad other tactics, right? So there was a really a concerted governmental program to destroy the social movements of the late 60s, and it's important that people know that. And prisons were one important part of that, but prisons and police violence and police misconduct were a central element of that, but not the only one. So I think in terms of understanding, one of the reasons why activists hate prison so much, it's helpful to understand a little bit about this program, Cointelpro.
I want to just say, the other day I was addressing a classroom of people, and it was unfathomable to me because I was speaking in this language that we started the conversation with, that when I was referring to this program, Cointelpro, that is a matter of public record, that anybody can access. We know now the things that happened behind this terrible federal program, and people scratch their heads, and maybe I'm hanging out with the wrong people, but I often get what do you mean? I mean, it's taken a long time for people to get up to speed, and again, this is why we rely on folks on the panel and books. Books are a real important element because that's something that can be passed around, and not everybody has internet access. So I'm reiterating it like you were reiterating.
There's a great book called The Cointelpro Papers that just reveal which were smuggled out by activists from a CIA office in Media, Pennsylvania. I mean, it's a great story all by itself. It's really worthy of like a crime novel, a spy, a movie, like a James Bond movie or something, like that that genre. But
so maybe we'll be ready for it.
Right.
Time now.
Brian Kruger.
So pick up. You were saying the various organizations that are devoted to liberating prisoners and bringing the information that are located here grew out of that time.
Yeah, and I think we have just a dynamic, progressive movement here. We have, the very serious tradition of Black organizing. You have you wouldn't tell now, but there was a very rich world of feminist organizing here. And you have your anti-war movements. You have various very strong, I think in the Bay Area, this idea of having because we live like at San Francisco State, we have San Francisco State has the only college of ethnic studies in the country. It is the only college of ethnic studies with departments in specialized, that focus on different communities. And that was because of a student strike, right? And people all talk about like Berkeley in the 60s, but actually this thing now, Gavin Newsom just signed it in this bill that you have to take an ethnic studies class in order to graduate from California high school. That all began, critical race theory really launched out of ethnic studies, and that all came, not exclusively, but there was a big and often under-recognized contribution from San Francisco State University's student strike.
Yeah, I agree. I also want to go back to this idea of the contradictions in California and even the Bay Area that you pointed to. We have the death penalty, for example. That's very un-Californian, right? That's an issue. When we talked the first time, you talked about how tech and movement work were actually kind of joined in the early days of your work. And I think these days we kind of see those as separate communities, right? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, I don't have as much. That's not like an area that I've really developed. But I mean, I think that the earlier moments of kind of tech, I think that there's a part of the innovative principle of tech work. There's a reason that it came from here, right? And I think that this idea of questioning things and of doing things differently, which Apple was happy to capitalize on as their tagline for a long time. At this point, it's so monetized. Tech is so incredibly monetized. It has become just another part of the imperial colonial project, right? So, but I think that in its earlier iterations, I think that somebody said in the New York Times once, the tech industry has become really good at solving problems that you might have if you're in your early 20s and have a lot of extra cash. So, and that's terrible, right? And untrue. And so I don't think, I think the contradictions of the Bay Area are vast. You have this very progressive tradition. You have these beautiful places like this bookstore there used to be tons of places kind of like this in San Francisco, these kind of beautiful places where a place of ideas and conversation, but as real estate becomes, more, kind of a cloud that you think about sometimes as opposed to an actual thing that you have, right? As spaces become more monetized, right? These have becomes a more and more precious place, right? I worked at New College for a long time, right? They had a lot of spaces, and now many of those spaces have disappeared, and that's because of this tremendous influx of capital that came from the wildly talented monetizing of the tech revolution that has come out of the Bay Area. Mm-hmm. So I think that is another contradiction, right?
Yeah. We talked to one of your colleagues, Keesley, who recently passed, but when we spoke, we also had publishing. We had a larger publishing industry here, right? And that's where the literature kind of met with the technological piece that you provide. And I mean, of course, prison radio would be impossible without technology. Right. So, but would you like to remember Keesley for?
Oh, right. So Keesley Jones is an old friend of mine, and he came out of the publishing world. He worked for a long time at Peach Pit Press, and then and then more recently at Heyday. But between those two gigs, he worked for us, and he was kind of reevaluating like what he wanted to do next when he left Peach Pit, and he came to work for us really as our office manager, which is a really funny thing to think of him as. But he happened to come in just as we were doing our big foray into publishing, and thank God, because we didn't know what we were doing, and he was this like veteran publisher, and so he was just enormously helpful. I don't think that this book would have been possible without him. And so, and he there's a Bay Area New York poet, Raymond Nat Turner, who wrote a beautiful poem about Keesley. That I wish I had queued up to bring here. Really holding up Keesley as, he says, white people you don't have to be John Brown. You could just be Keesley Jones. You could just be someone working every day to undermine racism in small, quiet, and dedicated ways. And it was just a really beautiful it was a beautiful piece and a beautiful testament to Keesley, who was a great person and who died over the summer from a surprisingly quick blood cancer. But so anyway, Keesley, we've had, there's a million great people out there, and if you just get out and do things, you find them, right? Yeah. And you get to be lucky enough to experience them. Yeah,
I know you don't do this work alone, so you offer opportunities for interns and people who might want to learn a little bit more about.
Right, we have an intern program, and we had to, and it was the pandemic was had a surprise silver lining, which is just as we desperately needed to hear from more people inside and to have like upper operations. A huge number of college students were left with nothing to do but be in their parents' bedrooms in Minnesota, and so we had we've always had a few volunteers in the office. We have a tiny office in the Mission District. You've been there, you know how tiny. It's really a hallway. But because everything had suddenly become remote, we were able to bring on 15 people as interns, and people have helped us. We were doing a documentary film on these organizers from Ohio that are Alice and Staunton Lind, and we really welcome student interns. We have ongoing transcription projects and recording projects, and we send out regular e-blasts to our followers, so those have to be written and generated and checked, and so we have editing, and we have like a lot of work, right? So that you can do from the confines. If you can get credit at your university, we're happy to support that. We have a Stanford student, B5, who helps us coordinate our interns. And B is great. And so you can just go to prisonradio.org. We just have this new website that I'm extremely excited about. Because we had for a long time a terrible, terrible website, and now we have a fabulous website. So, our since we're a media organization, it's our whole program. So it's not an add-on. It is our bookstore. So I check out our website if you're any interest in volunteering. If you just want to hear the voices of people inside, go to our website. And you can hear people's experiences and perspectives. And people have a lot of leadership to offer. I think it was Dave Edgars who went into San Quentin, came out and said the thing that hit him the most was the staggering waste of talent. And I think, so we just touch the surface of that at Prison Radio. But it's one of the few places that you can really easily access it right from your phone. You can subscribe to our podcasts and get regular updates from us.
What a great opportunity for people who are in places where they don't have access or ability to organize within their own community, but they can reach you this way and become involved.
Right.
And I know that draws a lot of young people here to the Bay Area just because they know that it is a vital community that they can be a part of. Is there anything that's like really front burner for you right now in terms of organizing or what's going on? COVID isn't over, and especially inside prisons. What else is?
Well, the one thing I would encourage people to look at the San Francisco Examiner published yesterday. The Chronicle. The Chronicle. Sorry, I realized. Sorry. Published yesterday a piece by Juan Haynes. And he lives inside San Quentin, and he is part of a lawsuit against San Quentin for their wildly negligent COVID practices that resulted in the historic outbreak on San Quentin in the summer of 2020. And so I recommend that people read that to kind of understand the chronology. I think it was an important historical event for us to understand because it happened right in front of us. And those of us who knew like early in the pandemic, like in March, when they shut down San Francisco, we were just reeling with the impact on prisons. Because if you talk to people in prison, they talk about cleaning all the time because hygiene is just impossible. And so they're always like, I have to clean my house. I have to clean my house. I have to, because you're just constantly trying to stay on top of like the basic cleanliness of whatever your space is. We knew hepatitis is rampant in prisons because of, an open tray of toothbrushes or 1,000 other, public health disasters. And we see prisons themselves as a public health disaster. So we knew that this was going to be horrible. Yeah. But I have a very close friend who is currently living on death row in San Quentin, even though he doesn't have any conviction. And he became sick. He got COVID in July of 2020 during this outbreak. And he called me. He calls my house maybe twice a week. And he called in early July, and I said, you don't sound right. You don't sound good. And he said, I just have a cold. Luckily, it's not COVID. And I thought, how do you know that? And I knew I knew it was this one phone call, and he laughed it off. And then the next time, and then I didn't hear from him for a week. And then his sister called me and said, he's in a hospital. And then there was this torturous period where we get no information. We don't know. We can't find what hospital it is. They will never tell us. His sister can't get health updates. We have no idea if he's dying. We have no idea if he's fine. We know nothing about his status. For 2 weeks, every day we go online to the CDC, our website, on their press releases to see if he's listed among the dead. It was just horrible. And then after 2.5 weeks, he calls us weak and tired from his cell. And he says, I was lucky to come down that sick that early because I still got moved to a hospital. Wow. And so, it was just a devastating time. It was a devastating time for me. And he has a large family, right? Remember, for every person in prison, there's a family that's destroyed. Okay, so it's to understand the consequences of prisons. It's not just that your schools are underfunded. It's not just that you have these terrible institutions that drive so much of our society. It's that community. And this is something that Angela taught me first, but then became so vividly evident from my work. The damage it does, if you have a community of people like the Black community that has the Black and brown communities that have lost so many people to prisons, you have to understand the impact. There are children who lost fathers, who lost mothers, uncles, aunts, brothers, children. It devastates your family, and it bankrupts your family because it's actually very expensive to have somebody in prison. And so, only poor people are in prison. And so it's in a big economic challenge for people who are already economically challenged. So I just think that one of the things about studying the COVID work is you begin to see the inside-outside tragedy in a different relief.
Yeah. I spoke to one woman whose husband was reporting as much as he could on his COVID status. But then there were, like you said, those long breaks in communication where there was no way to tell what the status was. Was he alive or what is happening? I mean, there's got to be a better way in this age of
well, you have to look at why do you have... Okay, so my friend in San Quentin, he's 62 years old. He was, convicted of something when he was 19. He spent his 20th birthday on death row. So how long do you have to keep people in prison, right? What is the value of keeping these 60-year-olds in prison, right? Is it that you're worried that he's going to go out and rob a liquor store again, right? Is that what you're worried about? Because I'm telling you, that's not going to happen, right? So I think that's the thing about mass incarceration. To do things differently means to not incarcerate on the mass level, because you just can't run an institution in a healthy way on that scale. It's too much.
Yeah. Well, I just can't thank you enough for the work that you do and your whole network of reporters from inside America's prison nation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this conversation.
Yeah, and we'll remind people that prisonradio.org. If people would like to donate, is there a donation button?
There's a donation button, and we are run entirely by gifts from small gifts from individual donors. So please give us a gift. Give us $20, give us $50, give us $1,000, give us whatever you can, because it is a string and a prayer that we run our operation on. So everybody's part-time. It's like we have a host of volunteers. But I also want to thank Bert and Beckett, not just for this program, but also for being here and continuing to be here and to provide these kind of literary spaces where people can talk about ideas and the world. So I just wanted to thank you to Bert and Beckett too.
Yeah, well, thank you again, and thanks again to Bert and Beckett. We're here every second Sunday of the month. Next month we will have Gail Meadows, principal of Meadows Livingstone School. I don't know if you know about them.
I live right next to Meadows Livingstone School. I have a friend who goes to school there. I've known a lot of people who've gone to school there, actually. Yeah,
all Afrocentric curriculum for about 40 years now. So she'll tell us where she's at with back to school and whatnot.
Oh, that will be great.
Yeah, and in December we will have another friend of the community, Lisa Tiny Gray Garcia.
I love Tiny.
Well, tune in.
She's an old friend of mine. Our kids went to school together. I love Tony. I think she's brilliant. I think she is really a prophet. Tiny is really a poetic prophet.
Yeah. So moving toward a better and brighter future, we have to end on hope, because you always do, and so does Mumia. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.